The Polite Society of Highbury. The village of Highbury was in the county of Surrey, and about 16 miles from London. There were several large houses in the neighbourhood. They were owned by the most important people in Highbury. The largest house was called Donwell Abbey. It was about a mile from the village, and it was the home of Mr. George Knightley, who also owned much of the land in Highbury. Mr. Knightley worked hard for the people of the neighbourhood, and everybody liked and respected him. Mr. Knightley's dearest friends were Miss Emma Woodhouse and her father, old Mr. Henry Woodhouse. They lived in a large and comfortable house in Highbury, called Hartfield. Emma and her father were important people in Highbury. Mr. Woodhouse had been a widower for many years. His wife, Emma's mother, had died when Emma was 3 years old. Mr. Woodhouse lived very quietly. He did not often leave his home and call on other people. He worried about his health. He often thought that he was ill. Emma Woodhouse, Mr. Woodhouse's younger daughter, was nearly 21 years old. Because her mother was dead, Emma was in charge of everything at Hartfield. She gave orders to the servants, and she decided how much money was spent. She was also the leader of the polite society in the neighbourhood. Emma Woodhouse was very pretty, very clever, and very rich. She was charming, too, and she had many friends. Emma always thought that she was right. Most of her friends agreed with her. Only Mr. Knightley ever told her that she was wrong. About 5 years earlier, Emma's elder sister, Isabella, had married Mr. Knightley's younger brother, John. John Knightley was a clever lawyer who worked hard. He lived with his wife and 5 children in a large house in London. They all visited Hartfield when they could. It was a cold evening in October. Emma Woodhouse and her father were sitting by the fire after dinner. They both looked sad. That morning, Miss Anne Taylor, who had been Emma's governess and friend for 16 years, had left Hartfield to get married. Miss Taylor had married Mr. Weston, a rich widower. Their home was Randall's, another large house, about half a mile from Hartfield. Mr. Woodhouse hated changes in his life, and Miss Taylor's marriage had made him very unhappy. He sighed. "I was very unhappy when your sister Isabella got married," Mr. Woodhouse said sadly. "Why did Miss Taylor have to get married too? She was happy living with us here at Hartfield. Why has she left us?" Emma smiled. "Miss Taylor is now Mrs. Weston, Papa," she said. "She married Mr. Weston because she loves him. Mr. Weston was born in the village. He is a good man. Mrs. Weston will be happy at Randall's. It is a very comfortable house. But Miss Taylor, Mrs. Weston, was happy here. Hartfield was her home," Emma's father replied. "Randall's may be a comfortable house, but Hartfield is a better place to live. It is much larger than Randall's. When shall I see Mrs. Weston again? I cannot walk to Randall's. It is too far." "Then we shall take our carriage," Emma told him. "And the Westons can come here whenever they like." Mr. Woodhouse sighed again, but he did not answer. At that moment, Mr. Knightley walked into the room. He had been in London for a few days, and the Woodhouses were delighted to see him. Mr. Knightley often visited Hartfield, and he was always welcome there. He was a tall, handsome man, and he was about 37 years old. He had known Emma Woodhouse all her life. "Did everything go well at the wedding of Miss Taylor and Mr. Weston?" Mr. Knightley asked cheerfully. "I hope that it did not rain. Did anyone cry? Somebody always cries at a wedding." "It was a very sad occasion," Mr. Woodhouse replied. "There was some rain this morning. I wanted Miss Taylor and Mr. Weston to delay their wedding, but Mr. Weston refused. He did not want to get married later. So now poor Miss Taylor has left Hartfield. I feel very sorry for her." "I can feel sorry for you and Emma, but not for Miss Taylor," Mr. Knightley said. "She has only one person to please now, not two people." Emma laughed. "And one of those two people is silly and thoughtless," she said. "That is what you are thinking, Mr. Knightley." "You are right, my dear Emma," her father said sadly. "I am a silly and thoughtless old man." "Papa, I was talking about myself," Emma said, laughing. "Mr. Knightley is always finding fault with me, not finding fault with you." Emma looked at her friend and smiled. "I do feel sad, Mr. Knightley," she said, "but I am happy too. I made the match between Miss Taylor and Mr. Weston 4 years ago. I knew that they would marry one day. I planned everything." "Then please do not make any more matches, my dear Emma," Mr. Woodhouse told her. "Whatever you plan comes true. You are always right." "I cannot stop matchmaking, Papa," Emma said. "Now I must help Mr. Elton to find a wife. He has been the vicar of Highbury for a year. He lives in the vicarage alone. He must be lonely." "If you want to help Mr. Elton, invite him to dinner," Mr. Woodhouse said. "Young men always like good food and good company. And ask Mr. Knightley to dinner too. Then we shall have some good conversation." Mr. Knightley laughed. "That is a much better idea, sir," he said. "Invite Mr. Elton to dinner, Emma. Give him some of your good food, but let him find his own wife. Mr. Elton is 26. He is old enough to find a wife for himself." But Emma had already chosen a wife for Mr. Elton. Her name was Harriet Smith. She was 17 years old and very pretty. Harriet was a pupil at Mrs. Goddard's school in Highbury. No one knew anything about the girl's family, but Emma was sure that Harriet's father was a gentleman. Harriet Smith was short and plump. She had beautiful blue eyes and fair hair. Harriet had good manners and a sweet smile, but she was not very clever. Harriet admired Emma very much, and she was delighted to be her friend. Mr. Knightley did not approve of Emma's friendship with Harriet Smith. He did not think that the two young women should be friends. He spoke to Mrs. Weston about it when he visited her at Randalls a few days later. "Harriet is not a good friend for Emma," Mr. Knightley said. "She flatters Emma too much." "But Emma can teach Harriet many things," Mrs. Weston replied. "Emma has made plans to read with Harriet. She wants to improve Harriet's education. She has already made a list of suitable books." "Emma has been making lists and plans ever since she was a child," Mr. Knightley said quickly. "She needs someone to make her think. Emma is intelligent. She has a good mind, and she should use it." Mrs. Weston smiled. "Emma is also very beautiful," she said, praising her friend. "Do you not think so, Mr. Knightley?" "Well, she is pretty, and I like looking at her," Mr. Knightley replied. "Emma is beautiful," Mrs. Weston said again. "Her hazel eyes are so bright and lively. Her complexion and figure are perfect. She is a good daughter, sister, and friend, but she does not like to be given advice. Please remember that." "I have been giving Emma advice for years," Mr. Knightley said, smiling. "But perhaps you are right. I shall say nothing about her friendship with Harriet Smith. I shall keep my thoughts to myself." Mr. Knightley stood up to leave. "I do think about what will happen to Emma," he added. "She says that she will never marry, but who knows what will happen to her in the future?" Mrs. Weston smiled. Emma and Mr. Knightley were good friends, but nothing more. They were not in love with each other. They were fond of each other. Mrs. Weston was pleased. The Westons had other plans for Emma. Many years before, Mr. Weston had been a soldier. He had been a captain in the army. When he was a young man, he had fallen in love with Miss Churchill. Her family lived in Enscombe, in the county of Yorkshire. The Churchill family was very rich. When Captain Weston married Miss Churchill, her brother and his wife were very angry. 3 years later, Captain Weston's young wife was dead, and he was a widower with a little boy named Frank. Captain Weston's brother-in-law and his wife felt very sorry for the little boy. The Churchills knew that Captain Weston could not look after his young son. They were very rich, and they offered the little boy a fine home and a good education. Captain Weston agreed. Mr. and Mrs. Churchill became Frank's guardians, and they gave him their family name, Churchill. Captain Weston became a merchant when he left the army. He made money in trade. 20 years later, he returned to Highbury. By this time, he was a rich man. He now called himself Mr. Weston. He bought a fine large house called Randalls and lived there alone until his marriage with Miss Taylor. Mr. Weston sometimes went to London and saw his son, Frank Churchill. The young man had never been to Highbury, but he promised to visit his father and his stepmother as soon as he could. Mr. and Mrs. Weston thought that Frank would be a good match for Emma Woodhouse. They wanted the two young people to marry. That was the Westons' plan. But they kept these thoughts to themselves. Chapter 2. Harriet Smith. Harriet Smith lived at Mrs. Goddard's school, but Emma often invited the pretty girl to Hartfield. Very soon, Harriet was given her own room in the Woodhouses' home. She saw Emma nearly every day and listened carefully to all her advice. In the summer, Harriet had stayed with the Martins of Abbey Mill Farm. The farm was on Mr. Knightley's land, near Donwell Abbey. The farm was owned by Mr. Knightley, and Robert Martin looked after it for him. Harriet talked a lot about the Martins. She told Emma about the size of the farm, the different animals, and the kind Martin family. Emma noticed this, and she decided to find out more about them. "Mr. Knightley says that the Martins work very hard," Emma said one day. "Mrs. Martin, her daughter and son-in-law, look after the farm well." "Oh, Mr. Martin, Mr. Robert Martin, is Mrs. Martin's son. He is not her son-in-law," Harriet said, laughing. "Mr. Martin is not married. He looks after the farm because his father is dead. Mr. Robert Martin is a very pleasant young man, and he was very kind to me. And his sister, Elizabeth, was kind too." Emma smiled and thought, "Is Harriet interested in Robert Martin? Does she hope to marry him?" This was not part of Emma's plan for her young friend. "The Martins are good people, I am sure, but they are farmers," Emma said. "You are my friend now, Harriet. You are meeting the best people in Highbury. I am Emma Woodhouse of Hartfield. The Martins can never be my friends, so they cannot be your friends. You must stop visiting them at once." Harriet's blue eyes filled with tears. "Oh, Miss Woodhouse, yes, I am sure that you are right," she said. "You have been so kind to me. I love coming to Hartfield. I understand you, Miss Woodhouse." Then she added sadly, "I will not go to Abbey Mill Farm again." Emma was pleased with Harriet's answer. "Good. Harriet, you must learn to choose your friends more carefully now," she said. "You are meeting real gentlemen at Hartfield. Mr. Knightley is the finest gentleman in Highbury. And Mr. Elton, our vicar, is a gentleman too. He often comes to dinner at Hartfield." "Mr. Elton is a very polite young man. He is handsome too," Harriet said slowly. "And you are a very pretty girl," Emma replied. "Mr. Elton can see that. He is very interested in you, Harriet." Harriet was pleased. Mr. Elton, a gentleman, was interested in her. Miss Woodhouse said this, so it must be true. Mr. Elton came to Hartfield that evening. Emma began to speak to him about Harriet. "Harriet Smith is a very pretty girl, is she not, Mr. Elton?" Emma said to the young vicar. "I have decided to paint a portrait of her. What do you think, Mr. Elton?" "I think that the portrait will be beautiful," Mr. Elton said quickly. "You are such a good artist, Miss Woodhouse. Anything that you do is perfect. I should very much like to see your painting of Miss Smith." Emma had begun many portraits of her family, but she had never finished them. She was now excited about painting a portrait of Harriet. She began the work the following day. Mr. Elton watched as Emma began to draw, and then to paint Harriet's portrait. He came to Hartfield every day until the portrait was finished. "It is a very pretty painting, Emma, my dear," said Mr. Woodhouse. "But in your portrait, Harriet is sitting in the garden. She is not wearing a shawl. She will catch a cold." Mr. Knightley looked at the portrait too. "You have made Harriet too tall, Emma," he said. "Oh, no, no," Mr. Elton cried. "This portrait of Miss Smith is perfect. Miss Woodhouse is so very clever." Then Mr. Elton added, "A beautiful portrait must have a beautiful frame. Let me take the painting to London for you, Miss Woodhouse. I shall get it framed there." Emma was very pleased. "Mr. Elton is in love with Harriet, I am sure," she said to herself. My plan is going well. Soon Mr. Elton will ask Harriet to marry him." That evening, Harriet came to Hartfield for dinner. She was holding a letter in her hand, and she was crying. "Please read this letter, Miss Woodhouse," Harriet said. "I want your advice. Please tell me what to do." Emma read the letter quickly. It was from Mr. Robert Martin, and it was a proposal of marriage. Mr. Martin was asking Harriet to marry him. "What must I do, Miss Woodhouse?" Harriet asked again. "You must answer the letter, of course," Emma replied. "Yes, but what must I say, Miss Woodhouse?" Harriet cried. "It is a good letter. My answer must be well written too. Please help me." "Write the letter yourself, Harriet. Then I shall read it," Emma said. "Mr. Martin will be unhappy, but your refusal must be very clear." "My refusal?" Harriet repeated slowly. "I have to tell him that I cannot marry him, Miss Woodhouse." "Of course," Emma said. "You must refuse him. You cannot marry a farmer, Harriet. You are my friend, and I am Emma Woodhouse of Hartfield. You know that I have an important position in Highbury. I could never invite the wife of Mr. Martin to my home." Harriet did not say another word. She wrote a letter of refusal to Robert Martin. Emma read the letter, and it was sent at once. Harriet was very quiet all the evening. Emma tried to make her happy. "There is another man who is interested in you, my dear Harriet," Emma said. "I am speaking about our vicar, Mr. Elton. Mr. Elton is a gentleman." "Mr. Elton?" Harriet repeated in surprise. "Yes, he is in London now. He is looking at your portrait and thinking about you. He is in love with you, I am sure of it. You will soon have another marriage proposal, Harriet." Harriet looked much happier. She forgot Robert Martin, and she began to think about Mr. Elton. The next day, Mr. Knightley called at Hartfield. Emma was surprised when he began talking about Harriet. "You have been a good friend to Harriet Smith," he said, "and now I think that she will have some good news for you." Emma was very surprised. Had Mr. Elton been talking to Mr. Knightley about his love for Harriet? "Robert Martin came to see me 2 evenings ago," Mr. Knightley went on. "He told me that he loved your friend Harriet Smith. He was going to write to her and propose marriage. It will be a good match. I know that you will be pleased. I expect that Harriet will be coming here soon to tell you her good news." "Mr. Martin has already sent the letter," Emma said quietly. "Harriet has refused him." Mr. Knightley stood up. He looked very surprised. "I know that Harriet is a silly girl," he said, "but she has refused Robert Martin. Are you sure, Emma?" "Yes, I saw the letter myself," Emma replied. Mr. Knightley was very angry now. "You saw the letter?" he said. "No, Emma, you wrote it, or you told Harriet what to write." "Perhaps I did," Emma replied. "But I was right. Robert Martin is not Harriet's equal." "No, he is far, far better," Mr. Knightley said angrily. "No one knows anything about Harriet Smith's family. She is pretty and good-tempered, but that is all. She has only a simple education and no sense. She was happy to know the Martins before she met you. You have spoilt Harriet Smith by making her your friend, Emma. You have made Robert Martin very unhappy. Harriet may soon be unhappy too. Why? I have introduced Harriet to people from good society, Emma replied. She is a very beautiful girl. There is a much more suitable young man in Highbury who will be happy to marry her. Mr. Knightley was more angry than before. If you are talking about Elton, you are wrong, he said. I know that young man better than you do. He may praise Harriet, but he will never marry her. She is poor. Elton will marry a rich woman as soon as he finds one. You have made a bad mistake, Emma. You have made a very bad mistake. Good afternoon. Emma smiled as Mr. Knightley left the room, but his words had upset her. Emma did not want to quarrel with Mr. Knightley, but she knew that he was wrong. Mr. Elton brought back Harriet's portrait from London that afternoon. The painting had been beautifully framed. The portrait was soon hanging on a wall in the sitting-room at Hartfield. Every time that Mr. Elton looked at the picture of the beautiful girl, he smiled. Emma made sure that Harriet was always at Hartfield when Mr. Elton came to dinner. Mr. Elton was always smiling now. Emma thought that she knew why. It was the middle of December, but the weather was fine. One morning, Emma and Harriet walked to a cottage which belonged to a poor family. They were taking food to them. The road to the little cottage went past the vicarage. Harriet said that she wanted to see the inside of Mr. Elton's house. Emma laughed. You will soon be married to Mr. Elton and living there yourself, she told Harriet. Then I shall be happy to visit you in your own home. Harriet blushed. Her face became red, but she looked very happy. I am very surprised that you have not married Miss Woodhouse, Harriet said cheerfully. You are so beautiful and so clever. I am happy as I am, Emma replied. I do not think that I shall ever marry. Why should I? I have my own home and a loving father. I have money too. But if you do not marry, you will be like Miss Bates in the village, Harriet said sadly. People will feel sorry for you. Miss Bates is poor. That is why people feel sorry for her, Emma replied. I am rich. I shall be busy and happy all my life. My sister has 5 children, my nephews and nieces. When I am old, I shall be able to enjoy their company. Miss Bates has a niece, Harriet said. Do you know her? Oh, yes. Jane Fairfax, Emma replied. Miss Bates is always talking about her. I am tired of hearing her name. I always have to meet Jane Fairfax when she comes to Highbury. Her aunt thinks that we are friends. But Jane is very cold and unfriendly. I do not like her. By now, Emma and Harriet had reached the poor family's little cottage. Emma spoke kindly to them and gave them the food. Very soon, the 2 friends were on their way home again. After a few minutes, they saw Mr. Elton walking towards them. The young vicar smiled. Good morning, Miss Woodhouse and Miss Smith, Mr. Elton said, bowing politely. Let me walk back to Hartfield with you. If Harriet was alone, Mr. Elton might propose to her, Emma said to herself. Then she had an idea. As they came near to the vicarage, she began to walk more slowly. My bootlace is loose. I must tie it, Emma said. Please go on. Mr. Elton and Harriet walked on together. Emma bent down quickly and broke the lace. Oh dear, Emma called out. My lace has broken. Mr. Elton, may I go into your house? May I speak to your housekeeper? Perhaps she can give me another lace. Mr. Elton was delighted to help Miss Woodhouse. Soon they were all inside the vicarage. Emma went to see the housekeeper and left Mr. Elton and Harriet together. Emma talked to the housekeeper for as long as possible. Then she went to the sitting room. When she entered the room, Mr. Elton and Harriet were standing by the window. But after listening to their conversation for a few minutes, Emma was disappointed. Mr. Elton was talking about food, not love. That young man is taking a long time to decide about marriage, Emma thought to herself. But he will ask Harriet to marry him soon. I am sure of it. Chapter 3. Mr. Woodhouse goes out to dinner. Another week passed, and Mr. Elton still had not proposed to Harriet. John Knightley was bringing his family to Highbury for the Christmas holiday, and Emma was very busy getting Hartfield ready for their visit. Mr. Woodhouse was a kind man, and he loved his family very much. But he was easily upset, and he worried about many things. He worried most about his health and the health of his family. He did not like bad weather and any kind of travel. He hated change of every kind. The weather was now very cold, and the ground was hard and slippery with ice. Mr. Woodhouse was very worried about the Knightleys' journey from London to Highbury. 16 miles is a long way, he said, and the roads are bad at this time of year. However, the Knightleys all arrived safely, and Mr. Woodhouse was delighted to see his daughter Isabella and her children again. Isabella, Mrs. John Knightley, was very like her father. She worried about her health and her children's health. Isabella was not as clever as her younger sister Emma, but she was very kind. John Knightley, Emma's brother-in-law, was a clever and very successful lawyer. But he was not as pleasant as his brother George Knightley of Donwell Abbey. John Knightley became angry easily, and he always said what he thought. Isabella was never upset by her husband's behaviour. She took no notice of it. John Knightley liked to tease his friends and relations, and his words sometimes upset them or made them angry. That evening, John's elder brother, Mr. George Knightley, walked to Hartfield from his house, Donwell Abbey. He was dining with the Woodhouses too. Mr. Knightley and Emma had not spoken to each other since their quarrel. Emma was holding her little niece in her arms when Mr. Knightley came into the sitting room. Emma looked up and saw that he was smiling at them both. "Is not little Emma a beautiful child?" Emma said quietly, looking down at the baby. "She is nearly as beautiful as her aunt," Mr. Knightley replied. "We can agree on that, if not on other things. Let us be friends again, my dearest Emma. Let us forget our quarrel." "I shall be pleased to forget it," Emma said. "I know that I am spoilt. I do not think that I was wrong about Harriet and Robert Martin. But I upset you, and I am sorry. Shake hands with me, Mr. Knightley. We have different ideas, but we can still be friends." They shook hands, and the rest of the evening passed very pleasantly. Only Mr. Woodhouse was unhappy. "My dear Isabella, you look tired," he said to his elder daughter. "You and the children have had a tiring journey. You must all go to bed early tonight. Dr. Perry is coming to see me tomorrow. He will check that I am well. He can check the children too. We must look after their health while they are at Hartfield." "The children are all quite well, Papa," Isabella said with a kind smile. "And I am not tired at all." Soon Isabella began to talk about her good friends, Mrs. and Miss Bates. She was pleased to hear that they were both well. "And what about Miss Bates's niece, Jane Fairfax?" Isabella went on. "Sometimes I see her in London with her guardians, the Campbells. Jane is so clever and so beautiful. Do you not agree, Emma? You could be such good friends if Jane lived in Highbury." "Emma has a friend, Miss Harriet Smith. She is a very pretty girl," Mr. Woodhouse said. "Harriet often stays with us. You will see her here very soon." Time passed quickly and happily at Hartfield. Emma, Mr. Woodhouse, Mr. Knightley, and Isabella and John Knightley were invited to dine with the Westons at Randalls on the 24th of December, Christmas Eve. Mr. Elton and Harriet were also invited to the dinner party that evening. Harriet had been staying at Hartfield, but then she caught a very bad cold. Isabella was afraid that her children would become ill too, so Harriet went back to the school where Mrs. Goddard could look after her. Emma went to see Harriet on the morning of the 24th of December. The poor girl had a sore throat, and her face was very pale. "You cannot come to Randalls tonight. You are too ill," Emma said. "Mr. Elton will be sorry that you are not there." As Emma left the school, she met Mr. Elton himself and told him about Harriet's cold and sore throat. "I am afraid that Harriet will have to stay at home tonight. She has a bad cold," Emma said. "And you have been visiting her, Miss Woodhouse?" Mr. Elton said in surprise. "That is not right. You must think of your own health." "You look rather pale, Mr. Elton," Emma told him. "Perhaps you should stay at home too." Emma expected Mr. Elton to agree. He could stay at home instead of going to dinner at Randalls, she thought. He could think of Harriet. He could write her a loving letter. But at that moment they met John Knightley. He offered to take Mr. Elton in his carriage to Randalls that evening, and with a happy smile, Mr. Elton agreed. As Mr. Elton walked away quickly, Emma's brother-in-law laughed. "That young man always smiles when he sees you, Emma," John Knightley said. "I think that he is in love with you. Please be careful." And he laughed again. He enjoyed teasing his sister-in-law. "No, you are wrong. Mr. Elton loves Miss Smith, not me," Emma said. "Mr. Elton and I are good friends, nothing more." But John Knightley laughed once again and shook his head. By the evening, the weather was extremely cold. Mr. Woodhouse, Emma, Isabella and her husband were going to travel from Hartfield to Randalls in 2 carriages. Mr. Woodhouse went in his own carriage with Isabella. Emma went with John Knightley in his carriage, and they drove to the vicarage to collect Mr. Elton. The vicar was waiting for them with a happy smile. He smiled at Emma all the way to Randalls, and did not stop praising her. John Knightley listened, but he said nothing. Emma was worried. Did Mr. Elton think that she loved him? No, it was impossible. At dinner, Emma sat next to Mr. Weston. He was talking about his son, Frank Churchill. "Yes, we had a letter from Frank this morning," Mr. Weston said, smiling happily. "My son is planning to visit us here in Highbury. He will be here in 2 weeks. His aunt, Mrs. Churchill, is often ill, and she does not like Frank to leave her. But he will come this time, I know." Emma was delighted to hear this news. She had always wanted to meet Mr. Frank Churchill, and she knew that Mrs. Weston did too. After dinner, Emma spoke to Mrs. Weston about Frank's visit. "I am looking forward to seeing Mr. Frank Churchill at Highbury," she said. "I hope that Mrs. Churchill will let him come," Mrs. Weston replied. "She is a bad-tempered woman, and she is very jealous of Mr. Weston. She wants to keep Frank with her at Anscombe, if she can." "If Frank Churchill wants to come here, I am sure that he will," Emma said. The gentlemen came into the room where the ladies were sitting, and everyone had tea. Mr. Elton sat next to Emma. He was smiling more and more. He began talking about Harriet's sore throat. But Emma soon understood that he was worried about her, not Harriet. "Miss Woodhouse must think about her own health, Mrs. Weston," the young vicar said. "Miss Woodhouse is important to us all. Please tell her to be careful, Mrs. Weston. She will listen to you." Mrs. Weston was surprised at Mr. Elton's words, but she said nothing. At that moment, John Knightley left the room for a few minutes. When he came back, he was smiling. "Well, sir," he said to Mr. Woodhouse, "we shall all have an exciting journey home. Snow has been falling for some time." Mr. Woodhouse hated excitement, and he especially hated bad weather. He looked worried, and Isabella did too. "My poor children," she cried. "I must get back to them tonight. Will the carriages be able to travel through the snow on the road?" Everyone stood up and began talking at once. Mr. Knightley looked at his brother John and frowned. Then he left the room. He came back a few minutes later. "There is very little snow," Mr. Knightley said quietly to Emma. "John was teasing us. If you all leave now, you will have a safe journey home. Shall I tell the servants to bring the carriages to the door?" "Yes, please do." "Thank you," Emma said quickly. Soon everyone was ready to go. Mr. Woodhouse slowly got into his own carriage, and Isabella followed him. John Knightley got in too, and the carriage moved on. Emma got into the second carriage, and she was followed by Mr. Elton, who sat beside her. They were alone. Then Emma saw that Mr. Elton had been drinking too much of Mr. Weston's good wine. As the carriage began to move, Mr. Elton took Emma's hand and held it in his own. "My dear Miss Woodhouse," he cried, "I cannot hide my feelings any longer. They are too strong. You must know how much I love you. Please accept my proposal of marriage and make me the happiest of men." Emma was angry, but she did not show her true feelings. "Mr. Elton, you should be saying these things to Harriet, not to me," she said quietly.
"Miss Smith? I do not care for Miss Harriet Smith."
Mr. Elton cried.
"I love you, Miss Woodhouse. Only you."
Emma was silent. She did not know what to say.
"You are making me very happy, Miss Woodhouse,"
Mr. Elton said, smiling.
"Your silence tells me that your feelings are the same as mine."
"Mr. Elton, you are very wrong," Emma said angrily. "I have no wish to marry anyone, and I would certainly never marry you." They sat silently until they reached the vicarage. Mr. Elton got out of the carriage without saying another word, and Emma was taken home to Hartfield. She did not sleep well that night. She had been very wrong about Mr. Elton. He had never loved Harriet Smith. "That silly young man thinks that he is my equal," Emma thought. "I cannot believe it. Mr. Knightley and his brother John were right about Mr. Elton, and I was wrong." Then Emma thought again about Harriet. Her friend would soon have to be told the truth. Mr. Elton had never loved the poor girl. But Emma was still sure of one thing. She was glad that Harriet had refused to marry Mr. Martin. The pretty girl could make a better match than the young farmer. Chapter 4. Frank Churchill. On Christmas Day, the ground was covered with snow. The Woodhouses and John Knightley and his family did not go out to pray in the church. The only visitor at Hartfield was Mr. Knightley. Emma felt more cheerful. She had decided not to tell anyone about Mr. Elton's proposal of marriage. The weather was too bad for Harriet to visit Hartfield, and Emma was pleased. A few days later the weather had improved. It was not so cold, and most of the snow had disappeared. John Knightley and his family got ready to leave Hartfield and return to their home in London. Mr. Woodhouse wanted Isabella to stay longer, but she had decided to go home. She was never happy when she was apart from her husband and children. That same evening, Mr. Woodhouse received a very polite letter from Mr. Elton. The young man was leaving Highbury for a few weeks. He was going to stay with friends in Bath. Mr. Elton sent Mr. Woodhouse his good wishes, but said nothing about Emma. All that night, Mr. Woodhouse worried about Mr. Elton's journey to Bath. Emma told Harriet the truth about Mr. Elton's feelings the next day. Harriet was very upset. The pretty girl cried and cried, but she did not blame Emma. Harriet blamed herself. Mr. Elton was a gentleman. He could never love her. She knew that now. Emma invited Harriet to stay at Hartfield. She tried to help her friend to forget Mr. Elton. The Westons had been expecting Frank Churchill to visit them at Randalls, but he did not come. Mrs. Churchill was ill again, and Frank could not leave her. "Mrs. Weston is very disappointed," Emma said to Mr. Knightley. "I am sorry too, but Mr. Weston now hopes that his son will come in the spring." "I cannot understand that young man," Mr. Knightley said angrily. The name of Frank Churchill always made Mr. Knightley angry. "He must be very selfish," Mr. Knightley went on. "I know that Mrs. Churchill is a difficult woman, but Frank Churchill could come to Highbury if he wanted to. He has plenty of money and plenty of time. I heard that the young man was on holiday in Weymouth in the summer, so he can leave Enscombe when he wants to. Frank Churchill must do his duty," Mr. Knightley went on, "and that duty is to visit his father and his stepmother, Mrs. Weston. He should tell Mrs. Churchill this. Emma laughed. "Mr. Knightley, you do not understand," she said. "Frank Churchill is dependent on the Churchills. They have given him money and a good education. It is his duty to please them." "It is his duty now to please his father," Mr. Knightley replied. "Frank Churchill has enough time to go on holiday by the sea. He has enough time to write long letters to the Westons. He must find enough time to visit Highbury too." "You want to think badly of Frank Churchill," Emma said. "You have never met him, but you do not like him." "That is not true," Mr. Knightley replied. "I do not want to think badly of him. I am sure that Frank Churchill is a fine young man with very good manners." "Then he will be welcome in Highbury," Emma told her friend. "How excited everyone will be when he comes at last." "I do not care if he comes or not," Mr. Knightley said. "I am not a silly young girl. I have no interest in Mr. Frank Churchill. I refuse to talk about him any more." A few days later, Emma and Harriet were walking together in Highbury. Harriet still wanted to talk about Mr. Elton, and everything in Highbury reminded her of him. Soon they were passing the house where Mrs. Bates and her daughter, Miss Hetty Bates, lived. The two ladies lived in a very small house in the centre of the village. The Bateses had very little money, so they had very few pleasures. They could not buy good wine, fine food, or expensive clothes. They were delighted when visitors called on them, and they were both very fond of Emma. Emma knew that it was her duty to visit the Bateses more often, but she thought that the ladies were very dull. Old Mrs. Bates was very deaf. Miss Bates was always talking about her niece, Jane Fairfax, and reading Jane's latest letter to her visitors. On that morning, Emma was tired of hearing Harriet talk about Mr. Elton, so she said to her young friend, "Perhaps we should call on Mrs. and Miss Bates. Their lives are very dull. It is our duty to make them happier." Miss Bates began talking as soon as her visitors came into the sitting-room. "My dear Miss Woodhouse, my dear Miss Smith, what a pleasure it is to see you in our little house," she cried. "How is dear Mr. Woodhouse? Our dear friend Mrs. Cole has just left. She was talking about Mr. Elton. It is a pity that he has gone to Bath. How we shall all miss him. He has such good manners and such a pleasant smile. Mrs. Cole was kind enough to eat some of my cake," Miss Bates went on. "Do sit down, Miss Woodhouse. Perhaps you and Miss Smith will have some cake too." Emma smiled politely and accepted a piece of cake. Miss Bates soon began talking about her niece, Jane Fairfax. "Yes, our dear Jane is in Bath too. Everyone there admires her. She dances so beautifully, of course, and she is so clever." "Have you had a letter from Miss Fairfax recently?" Emma asked politely. "I hope that she is well." "Thank you, Miss Woodhouse, thank you. Yes, we had a letter from Jane this morning. It is so kind of you to ask about her. Now, where is it? Yes, here it is. It is just a short letter this time. Only 2 pages. Miss Fairfax has beautiful handwriting," Emma said. "Oh, thank you," replied Miss Bates quickly. "Mother, did you hear that? Miss Woodhouse has given us her opinion about Jane's handwriting. She says that Jane has beautiful handwriting." "Beautiful handwriting," she said again more loudly.
My mother is rather deaf,
Miss Bates said with a smile.
I sometimes have to say things more than once. But Mother can always hear what Jane says. Dear Jane speaks so very clearly. It will be delightful to see her again.
Is Miss Fairfax coming here soon? Emma asked. She was surprised. She has not been in Highbury for more than 2 years, I think.
You are right, Miss Woodhouse,
Miss Bates said happily.
You have remembered the time exactly. Yes, Jane will be here next week.
Next week? Emma repeated in surprise.
Yes, next week,
Miss Bates said with a smile.
It is all in her letter, and she will be staying with us for 3 months. Mother and I are so pleased.
How can Miss Fairfax be away from the Campbells for so long? Emma asked.
Oh, the Campbells, dear Jane's guardians, are going to Ireland,
Miss Bates replied.
Their own daughter, such a plain girl, has married a Mr. Dixon. Mr. and Mrs. Dixon have a house in Ireland. The Dixons are very fond of Jane. They all visited Weymouth together. Mr. Dixon saved Jane before she fell into the sea.
Emma was interested, and her clever mind was busy at once. Why is Jane not going to Ireland? She thought. Perhaps Mr. Dixon, whose wife is very plain, is too fond of the beautiful Jane Fairfax. Emma wanted to know more. I am surprised that Miss Fairfax is not going to Ireland, she said. Mrs. Dixon is Miss Fairfax's dear friend, I believe.
That is true, very true,
Miss Bates replied.
Mr. and Mrs. Dixon both wanted Jane to go with them, but our dear niece has been ill. Jane caught a cold in November and has not been well since then. If she comes to Highbury, Mother and I can look after her. Jane is always happy here, as you know, Miss Woodhouse. But you must read dear Jane's letter for yourself, said Miss Bates, picking up some pages from a chair. She explains everything so clearly.
Emma stood up quickly.
I am afraid that we must go now, she said. My father is waiting for us. Thank you so much for telling us about Miss Fairfax.
As they walked back to Hartfield, Harriet asked Emma to tell her all about Jane.
Why does Jane Fairfax live with the Campbells and not here in Highbury with Mrs. and Miss Bates?
Harriet said. It is an interesting story, Emma replied. Jane Bates, Mrs. Bates's younger daughter, married a soldier named Lieutenant Fairfax. He was killed fighting for his country soon after baby Jane was born. Before he died, Lieutenant Fairfax saved the life of Colonel Campbell. Then, when Jane Fairfax was 3 years old, her mother died and Jane became an orphan. The Campbells looked after Jane as well as their own daughter, Emma continued. And when Jane was 9 years old, they became her guardians. The Campbells gave Jane a good home and a good education, and she has lived with them ever since.
So the Campbells are rich,
Harriet said.
No, they are not,
Emma replied. If Jane does not marry, she may have to become a governess. She has had a good education and she is clever. She will do well. Let us talk about someone else, Harriet, Emma said.
I am tired of Jane Fairfax. I was hoping that Frank Churchill was coming to Highbury, not Jane. I am far more interested in Frank."
Emma did not like Jane Fairfax, but she did not know why. The two girls were the same age. Chapter 5. Jane Fairfax. It was now February. Emma soon gave Mr. Knightley the news that Jane was coming to Highbury. "I am pleased to hear it," Mr. Knightley said. "She will be a better friend for you than Harriet Smith. You do not like Jane because she is better educated than you, Emma. She reads many more books, and she plays the piano better than you do. She is a very beautiful and a very clever young woman."
"Yes, but she is so cold,"
Emma had replied.
"I do not enjoy her company. It is difficult to talk to Jane Fairfax. I never know what she is thinking. Her aunt talks too much, and Jane Fairfax does not talk enough."
But when Jane arrived in Highbury, Emma felt that she had been very unkind to her. Jane was tall, and she had a good figure. She had beautiful dark grey eyes and dark brown hair. Her skin was pale, and she had a lovely complexion. Everyone agreed that Miss Fairfax was very charming. Emma decided to be more friendly towards the beautiful girl, and she soon invited Jane, Mrs. Bates, and Miss Bates to spend the evening at Hartfield. But after one evening, Emma's unkind feelings about Jane Fairfax returned. Emma decided that she did not want to see Jane again. She had asked Jane many questions about the Dicksons, but Jane's answers were very short, and they did not give Emma much information. Then Emma found out that Jane had met Frank Churchill in Weymouth.
"You have met Mr. Frank Churchill, Miss Fairfax? You are so lucky," Emma cried. "Everyone in Highbury wants to see Mr. Frank Churchill. Is he handsome?"
"People think that he is," Jane replied.
"And does he talk well? What about his manners and his conversation?"
"People say that his manners are good," Jane said quietly, but she refused to give an opinion of her own. The next morning Mr. Knightley came to speak to Mr. Woodhouse about business. Mr. Knightley had also been at Hartfield the previous evening. He began to talk with Emma about her guests. "I had a very pleasant time last night," Mr. Knightley said. "You and Jane gave us some good music, Emma, and you gave us some good conversation." Emma smiled.
"Jane certainly plays the piano very well," she said. "But her conversation is not interesting. Jane said very little all the evening. She did not answer any of my questions. She is not good company."
Mr. Knightley looked unhappy. "I would like you to be friends with Jane," he said.
"Jane does not make friends easily," Emma replied. "But she is very beautiful and very charming. I admire her, but I feel sorry for her too. Her life will not be easy, like mine."
Mr. Knightley was pleased at Emma's words, but Mr. Woodhouse looked sad.
"The Bateses do not have an easy life either," he said. "They have very little money. I wish that we could do more for them, Emma, my dear. Ah, we have just killed one of our pigs here at Hartfield. Perhaps we could send Miss Bates some of the meat." "Papa, Do not worry, Emma said. I have already sent a large piece of the pork to Miss and Mrs. Bates's house. Mr. Knightley was about to speak when the sitting-room door opened and Miss Bates and Miss Fairfax came in. "Oh, Miss Woodhouse," Miss Bates cried, "we have come to thank you for the piece of pork. You are so very kind. And we have some news to tell you. You will never believe it, but Mr. Elton is to be married. Yes, married. He is getting married to Miss Augusta Hawkins of Bath. We shall all have a new neighbour at Highbury. What do you think about that, Miss Woodhouse?" "I am sure that everyone will wish Mr. Elton happiness," Emma said quietly. "And Miss Hawkins too, of course." Emma turned towards Jane Fairfax. "What do you think about the news, Miss Fairfax?" "I do not know Mr. Elton, so I can have no opinion," Jane replied. "And Mr. Elton has only been away 4 weeks," Miss Bates said. "I did think at one time, perhaps a young lady in Highbury. But no, Mr. Elton is a fine young man. Well, Jane," Miss Bates went on, "we must be going now. Your grandmamma will be waiting for us. She will be worried. I think that it is going to rain. Oh, Mr. Knightley, are you leaving too? Goodbye, Mr. Woodhouse, and dear Miss Woodhouse. Mr. Elton, marrying Miss Hawkins. She will be Mrs. Elton, a new neighbour. It is so exciting." A few minutes after this, the rain began to fall heavily. As soon as the rain had stopped, Emma had another visitor. "Oh, Miss Woodhouse, what do you think has happened?" Harriet cried as she ran into the room. Emma thought that her friend had heard about Mr. Elton. But that news would have made Harriet upset. Harriet looked very happy. "I was in Mrs. Ford's shop in Highbury when they came in," Harriet went on. "I did not know what to do." "What do you mean? Who came in?" Emma asked her friend. "Why, Elizabeth Martin and her brother, of course," Harriet replied. "I did not know what to do. I could not leave the shop, because it was raining hard. Then Elizabeth came to talk to me, and she was so kind. Mr. Robert Martin spoke to me too. Oh, Miss Woodhouse, I was so happy when he spoke to me. Now I do not know what to think. Please help me." At first, Emma had no answer. "The Martins behaved well," she said after a few minutes. "And you did too, Harriet. It was very difficult for you, but it is over now. You must stop thinking about that meeting. You will never see the Martins here at Hartfield. It may be months before you see them again." "Yes, of course, dear Miss Woodhouse," Harriet said sadly. "And now I have news for you," Emma said. The news about Mr. Elton's engagement was a shock for Harriet. She stopped talking about the Martins at once. All her conversation was now about Miss Hawkins of Bath. Mr. Elton loved Miss Hawkins, so she must be very beautiful. 2 days later, the Westons saw Emma walking by herself in Highbury. They stopped their carriage and began to talk to her. "We were coming to Hartfield to tell you the news," Mrs. Weston said. "Frank Churchill will be here tomorrow." "Yes, Frank is coming at last," said Mr. Weston. "Here is his letter. He will be here tomorrow at about 3 o'clock. He is staying for 2 weeks. "I shall be so happy to have Frank with us at Randalls," Mrs. Weston said. "We shall bring him to Hartfield very soon, Emma." But Frank Churchill surprised everyone. He arrived a day early. By 12 o'clock the following morning, Mr. Weston and Frank Churchill were talking with Mr. Woodhouse in the sitting-room at Hartfield. As soon as Emma came into the sitting-room, Mr. Weston introduced Frank to her. Emma saw a tall and very handsome young man who had very good manners. Frank Churchill was also a very good talker. He had ideas and opinions about everything. Emma was soon enjoying his company very much. "I believe that I know a neighbour of yours, Miss Woodhouse," Frank Churchill said. "The lady's name is Fairfax, but the family's name is Barnes or Bates, I think. Do you know them?" "We all know the Bateses. They are our good friends," Mr. Weston said. "You met Jane Fairfax in Weymouth, I think, Frank. You must visit Miss and Mrs. Bates. They will be glad to see you." "There is no hurry," Frank said. "Any day will do. Yes, I did meet Miss Fairfax in Weymouth. She was there with the Campbells." "Please visit the Bateses today, Frank," his father said. "Old Mrs. Bates is Jane's grandmother. Mrs. Bates and her daughter Hetty are very poor. It would be very impolite if you do not visit Jane." As Mr. Weston and his son were leaving, Emma spoke to Frank. "Jane Fairfax is a very elegant young lady," she said. "Yes, I suppose so," said Frank quietly. Emma was surprised. She had thought that a young man like Mr. Frank Churchill would be interested in the elegant and charming Miss Fairfax. Frank Churchill visited Hartfield again the next day. This time he came with Mrs. Weston. The young man seemed to like his stepmother very much. Emma was delighted. The weather that day was good. Frank, Emma, and Mrs. Weston walked in the garden at Hartfield, and then they went into the village of Highbury itself. Frank Churchill wanted to see everything, and everything in Highbury pleased him. They all stopped outside the Crown Inn. When Frank heard that the inn had a ballroom, he became very excited. He wanted to see inside the room at once. "This room is perfect for dancing," Frank Churchill said as he looked around. "We must have a ball while I am in Highbury. I am sure that there are plenty of young people here who would enjoy dancing at a ball." After several minutes, Frank, Emma, and Mrs. Weston left the inn and walked on. They were soon outside the house where Mrs. and Miss Bates lived. "Did you visit the Bateses yesterday?" Emma asked Frank Churchill. "Yes, I did," Frank replied. "I saw all 3 ladies, Mrs. and Miss Bates and Miss Fairfax. Miss Bates did not stop talking for more than half an hour." "Did you think that Miss Fairfax was looking well?" Emma asked. "No, I did not think that she looked well. Not well at all," Frank said quickly. "She is always pale, but now she looks ill." "Did you often see Miss Fairfax in Weymouth?" Emma asked. "Yes, I met her and the Campbells quite often," Frank replied. And I met Mr. Dixon too, of course. He was not married to Miss Campbell then. Mr. Dixon admired Miss Fairfax, and he admired how she played the piano too. Have you heard Miss Fairfax play the piano, Miss Woodhouse? Yes, I have, Emma replied. And I agree with Mr. Dixon. Miss Fairfax plays very well. Miss Fairfax does everything extremely well, Frank said, smiling. However, Mr. Dixon married Miss Campbell. I do not know what Miss Fairfax thought about that. You have been Miss Fairfax's friend longer than I have. I cannot say that I am Miss Fairfax's friend, Emma said. She is very reserved, and it is difficult to know her. I often think that she is hiding something, that she has a secret. I agree with you, Frank Churchill said. It is difficult to be fond of a reserved person. Emma was very pleased with Mr. Frank Churchill. His conversation was interesting and amusing. He was charming, and he had good manners. Emma enjoyed his company, but she was very surprised when Frank went away the next day. He rode to London to have his hair cut. Mr. Weston laughed, but Mrs. Weston shook her head. Mr. Knightley had not approved of Frank Churchill from the first time that he had heard about him. When Emma told Mr. Knightley about Frank's visit to London, he was silent for a moment. Then he said, "It is just as I thought. Frank Churchill is a silly, spoilt young man."